Welcome. So let's take a look at social class and differential educational attainment, or DEA, and the factors happening inside school. So with the internal factors, obviously this is everything happening inside school. With this, we're going to focus on labelling processes, formations of subculture, and identity. What is important to remember is all this stuff happening inside school is heavily influenced by what's happening outside of school. The two go together. So although we are separating them out, it's just important to remember that home life, parental background, social class, material, cultural factors are all going to have a play and an influence on what's happening inside the education system. So first but not least, what we've got is all the labelling theories that you would have covered in social action approaches. So Rosenthal, Jackson, Ball, Sewell, and one of the things we can do is we can use all these thinkers again for internal factors. Essentially, all these labelling processes took place inside education. They caused a difference in class and class achievement, so we can use them here. But as part of its own topic, there are some new thinkers to add. Now, the first thinker is Becker. Becker conducted interviews with 60 teachers and found that teachers had this idea of what is a perfect student, this ideal image or this ideal student. And it was the perfected student who worked hard and completed their tasks. They were on time, punctual. And for teachers, middle class pupils were most likely to match this mythical ideal student. The working class were the furthest away from it. So it kind of fed into the positive and negative labelling of students. Rist conducted observations in a kindergarten class looking at how teachers again used home background information, where they lived, their parents' employment, and their income levels, to separate students into different groups. And again, in this case, the middle class were labelled as tigers and they were sat towards the front of the room, while working class were labelled as clowns and sat at the back. So the middle class got more attention, more praise, more support. And we've also got Gilbert and Yodel. Now again, Gilbert and Yodel, very similar to the work of Ball, in the sense they looked at how setting and streaming was based on teachers' notions of ability. And particularly what they highlight is that students put into lower sets, lower streams, are less likely to achieve high grades, particularly if they're put in for foundation papers or lower level papers where they may be capped at the highest grade they can achieve. And this again reinforces the difference between the working class and the middle class. We also see Lacey popping up here. So talking about subcultures and particularly how subcultures are formed. First of all, she highlights the idea of differentiation, that once teachers have labelled students, they internalize the label, the self-fulfilling prophecy happens, they begin to differentiate themselves and they will move into different groups of different other peer groups. So generally the lower social class kids who are more likely to be anti-school and negative labelled form a group, the middle class kids do the same. This then leads to what she calls polarization, in which the two become further apart. The middle class pro-school kids become really good and high achieving. The working class anti-school kids again go the opposite direction and become worse, and it causes this great division between two. It's very much like the poles of a magnet repelling each other. So Lacey's theory is quite good because it fills in that middle gap between being labelled and self-fulfilling prophecy. Students differentiate, they polarize, and then subcultures become more kind of divided and more sort of contradictory to one another. Bourdieu pops up with habitus. Habitus is a combination of the different levels of culture and capital. So I like habitus because it's a combination of cultural capital, social capital, educational capital, economic. It's a combination of all the factors into kind of one nice little concept. And ultimately, his argument is that the middle class possess more habitus than the working class, and often the habitus of the middle class is preferred in education compared to the habitus of the working class. So very much the same as his arguments about capital that you would have seen in Marxism and earlier topics, but really this is a kind of all of them lumped into one core concept. Now Archer brings in another argument, talks about Nike identities, which again is a very interesting argument because it's focusing on how what working class students wear, and particularly designer clothing like Nike branded clothing, becomes a sense of their self-worth. So they use these clothing items as a symbol of their culture. Again, if you remember back to the late 90s, early 2000s, you would have had the chav culture. And I know it's not appropriate to use that word, but the idea being that this culture was sort of identified with Burberry clothing, and that became symbolic of their culture. What Archer argues when it comes to education is that obviously children, young people wear these night clothing, hoodies, trainers to school. It goes against the school dress code. It's seen as a violation of dress code, and for the students, they see it as an act of symbolic violence. Their culture, their identity is being criticised, diminished, banned. And what happens is obviously the middle class kids don't understand the significance of these cultural items, or teachers don't understand the culture of them. And what happens, it reinforces the idea that school's not for them. Their culture, their identity has been rejected. And often, in some cases, even students will prefer to go into isolation or be excluded in order to keep their trainers, keep their hoodie, keep their identity. Last but not least, we have marketization, which again is very familiar from New Right, from CLASS and DEA externally. And it's the same process. Schools pick the best students. They want to do well. I've done a video on this separately, which is worth watching to go through the marketization process. But ultimately, Bartlett also argues that schools select the best kids. They cherry pick, they cream skim the higher achieving students, the more desirable students, because they want to get good grades, because grades equals more money. And last but not least, the educational triage. So again, marketization divides students into different groups. Gilbert and Yodel talk about how they are students triaged into this A to C economy. Ultimately, high achievers will be put to one group and generally left to themselves because they're going to pass. Kids who are going to fail are ignored because they're going to fail no matter what you do. It's the CD border kids who are going to be given more support, more attention, to push them over that into the C and above bracket, because that's when they become valuable and profitable as results. And again, ultimately, the kids in this band are probably more likely to be middle class, maybe a few working class, who will be tipped over. So there we have internal factors of education, summed up a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but it's a very good summary of everything happening inside education. As I said, don't forget, a lot of these influences, a lot of these processes have their origins, their beginnings in the external home lives of the students. Thanks for watching.